while I was thinking in the talk, I realized that the initial objective, which was essentially say how to cure cancer and save the planet, was too much maybe for half an hour. So I decided to explain just how to save the planet. And so if you want to know the other thing, I can tell you in private. So the talk I'm going to give concerns a real big problem and a highly speculative and radical idea. And the interest of presenting this here is that I think this is an idea that is worth pursuing, that is a relevant way of approaching a major problem that will require a big synthesis of areas from theoretical ecology to synthetic biology. And it has to do, in a way, with work we do in our lab. Our lab has a big, ambitious program on synthetic biology that tries to address what biologists call major transitions. So how do you get into major innovations through evolution? How do you invent multicellularity? How do you go into collective intelligence, cooperation, etc.? And the interesting thing of synthetic biology, which I'm going to try to give a picture of that, is that it offers a new way of approaching these problems. It's not observing nature, it's not doing models, it's not doing theory, it's actually building things. So building things and see what are the boundaries of what you can construct in the lab. How far can you go by pushing single-cell organisms into multicellularity? How far can you go into pushing systems that are not swarm intelligent agents into swarm intelligence? And related to that, there's a transition that we are facing now, which is that because of human actions, we are pushing the planet into a new state that is not desirable for us. Sometimes when I talk to microbiologists, some of them claim that, well, you know, life will keep going. But when you have children, then it's not kind of very satisfactory idea that microbes will dominate the new world. But yeah, you know, you have to be more optimistic. And so you can say that the Anthropocene, the period of time where we are living, is a different state, and that a new state is waiting for us unless we do something about it. And when you talk about climate change, it's easy to kind of feel that this is a very big thing. We don't know much about some scales. It's kind of beyond our grasp. And I tend to use this example of a kind of a small-scale event that happened in the 1930s in the state, the famous or infamous Dust Bowl, when because of intensive use of soil in the former beautiful and vanished prairie, the American prairie, what happened essentially was the soil got under a stress state, and when the dry time came, and nobody knew about biology of grasslands, and what happened essentially was that the topsoil just started to float around, and that was a big catastrophe. And it's interesting also to know the story about that. I don't have time for that, but I recommend this book, which I found really fascinating, where essentially you see how things unfold, how dramatically things change, because actually it crossed a tipping point, and how politics worked. Essentially, the Republicans at that time were saying that, you know, these poor people there, you know, I don't think they say just they can go to hell, but essentially they were saying there's nothing to save there. Roosevelt had a different idea. He thought that it was worth trying to do something. There was a guy, which unfortunately I don't remember the name, who actually was trying to push that. Let's try to actually recover the system and recover the people. Let's not abandon them. But Washington was not very much on that stuff, except what happened is that when they had to vote about that, a dust bowl came to Washington. And then they realized that, wow, maybe it is a problem for us too. And then everything changed. So we had a beautiful talk in the morning session about predictability. And predictability is a major issue here. Because usually you confront people that essentially say, well, what can you predict actually? One is things want to happen. And this is kind of a nice scheme about things that we can predict. It's kind of a sad thing, but things that we can actually predict. And I want to turn this question a little bit into something else. a major issue here that has been building up in the last years is the problem of catastrophic shifts. The ongoing evidence that we have that ecological systems can switch into a completely different state in an irreversible way. That has happened in fisheries, so it's not like a theory. And that particularly in some ecosystems in the world, particularly dryland ecosystems, that's something that might happen. And a number of people, very bright people, has been actually building theoretical models about that. And it's interesting because these models tell us something about prediction, right? One of those, which again has to do with drylands, with arid ecosystems. Have in mind that arid ecosystems are almost 40% of ecosystems in the world, and that millions of people depend on that. So if these systems collapse into desert, that doesn't mean that we just become desert. It's really a humanitarian catastrophe. One of the most popular models that has been analyzed is a model where we consider a system where you have vegetation, you have a soil that can be used for vegetation to grow up more seedlings, and you have a desert state, a state where you cannot have vegetation growing. And the biology that we know about these systems allow us to make a very well-defined causal diagram about how these three components of the system change. And no matter what kind of model you use, essentially you obtain the same kind of nonlinearity. And that nonlinearity tells us that, for example, if stress in the system of any kind, because there's a reduction of precipitation or is overgrazing, we can predict very well that you can go smoothly in a green state, having this vegetation that is patchy, but suddenly go into the desert state. And you cannot go back to the previous one just because you add a little bit of precipitation or you prevent grazing. There's been a lot of work on that. A lot of models. I just want to emphasize that you can make very simple models when you can actually see that you have to expect that kind of shift, and that if you make more sophisticated models, you get the same kind of pattern over and over again. So I can predict one thing. Maybe I cannot say exactly when is this going to happen, but if the trends go on and on, it's going to happen, right? I'll give you an example of a model that is based on a very simple cellular automaton. We have the green patches of vegetation. The parameter D weights the amount of grazing that is being operating on the system by cattle, for example. And as you can see, just changing a little bit the parameter, in one case, you get the patchy vegetation, which is something that you observe in many, many cases, right? And just changing a little bit, you go into the shift. So essentially, you lose the system and you go to the desert state. Okay? There's a number of things that you can actually measure from real systems about the statistical structure of the patchiness that are consistent with it's called warning signals, with statistical distributions that suggest that the system is approaching that kind of transition. That's a major issue, of course. It's interesting in medicine also. How do you get into that? How do you measure the distance into the tipping point? Okay? All right. For those who might say, well, this must be a speculation, this alternative states, this is a satellite photograph using infrared, which is a good way of actually having measures about the state of the soil connected to vegetation. You have the frontier between Israel and Egypt, and as you can see very well, it's a kind of a straight line, right? On one side, there was, I will say, not much control about the grazing pressure that you allow to be on vegetation, whereas there were other policies being applied to the other side. And you can see very well these two alternative states. So it's not like speculation or theory. It's perfectly there. So we are facing the problem, not only on dryland ecosystems, in other ecosystems, that things might become bad in the future, right? I know in the States there's a lot of kind of symmetry breaking between people that supports that and people who doesn't. But the thing is that I think that if you don't see that, essentially it's because you have a political view of what happens in nature. And one possible way of addressing that, you have heard a lot about the Kyoto Protocol, sustainability practices, carbon sequestration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The thing is that we are probably running out of time, really. And some people have suggested in the past, and now it's becoming a hot topic again, the potential for geoengineering. So how can you change actively as an engineer the climate? Always in the direction of reducing temperatures. So in a way of acting not on carbon dioxide, but on the way temperatures rise. And, and that means usually very expensive technologies, so staggering really cost of that, like using huge towers that will inject vapor water in the atmosphere, kind of creating clouds. Some more cheap ways of approaching that involve using aerosols. So as when volcanoes get into eruption, you get a huge amount of aerosols in the atmosphere, and that can cool down actually the planet temporarily. None of these methods address the problem of carbon sequestration, which is the real problem. Other methods have received mixed kinds of criticisms. For example, reforestation. There's a lot of hype about that. Is reforestation going to save the planet? Is it an effective way of doing that? Is the time scale of doing that enough? Well, that's our proposal. So let's take a different view. Let's consider the following possibility. We have now the potential of manipulating organisms in ways that were not available 20 years ago. And that means that there's one possibility, which is to actually design organisms that actually interfere in ecosystems, so redesign to some extent some ecosystems, and use that to shift the state into a new state, right? In a way to avoid tipping points. That's the only things you can find in the literature, right? My initial position paper, and a paper we just have online with my two colleagues, Raúl Montañez and Salvador Durán Nebreda, who are actually starting a proof of concept kind of experiments in our wet lab. I must say that I'm by training theoretician. I've been a theoretician for 25 years. And when 5 years ago we said in my center that we were going to start a wet lab, everyone was terrified, like I say, with the theoreticians going to the experiments. So this seems to work anyway. For those of you who might have that in mind, this is kind of connected with the old idea of terraformation Mars in particular, right? It's just loosely connected because the idea of terraforming Mars means that if you use synthetic biology, that you engineer a bacterium that is able to go into a planet and survive, but essentially the planet is not occupied probably by anyone. So essentially it's an empty space where you're willing to expand. Our biosphere is different. Our biosphere is already occupied by ecosystems, so you have to think about that context. And incidentally, there's this Mars One story that you might have heard about that you can actually apply. It's a one-way ticket to Mars. I always think that we could find the name of some politicians which could go there, right? Anyway, so the idea is using synthetic biology, meaning engineering living matter. This is a field that is, you could say, in the adolescence. It's kind of the granddaughter of genetic engineering. Except now we really want to actually engineer circuits, engineer functionalities within cells and tissues. And I think at this point, despite some hype, we are really in the exponential phase. It starts really to delivering really interesting things. And the historical development of that includes a number of really relevant successes that go from the first switches and clocks to engineering bacteria that can actually fight cancer cells, which is something that at the beginning was just a kind of proof of concept that has been developing very well, very interestingly. So it's really promising. And just to mention, in my lab, we use synthetic biology, for example, to try, as I mentioned before, to manipulate single-cell kind of organism into multicellularity. How far can you go with that? And a more funny thing, for example, is to manipulate bacteria that can now behave like ants. So these ants collectively can solve problems, as ant colonies do. And it's doable, actually. All right. So why synthetic biology? how good is that? How good is the kind of engineering approach? Well, if you want to define the three kind of rules that you want for success, if you want to engineer the planet, you would like to reach the right scale, okay? Trying to avoid a big problem. If you're engineering, you build machines, you have to build the machines, right? And that's a costly thing. And one of the approaches of geoengineering is building millions of microsatellites that go into the stratosphere and can deflect the light from the sun. As you can imagine, this is possible, I guess, but kind of difficult. Then restored the degraded state, which doesn't mean you go back into previous state. I think is a point that is important to make. And minimize evolvability, right? Why synthetic biology? Well, because living organisms, these living machines that you build, okay, have this nice property of replicating. So they actually can scale up into the problem if you do it properly. They can actually, in principle, restore what you want to restore, right? And there's ways of actually taking into account evolvability. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, one is, this is a really interesting talk, and the other thing is, yes, but what about undesired effects, right? And I think that Jurassic Park kind of reflects very well the problem. And incidentally, I want to mention that when Jurassic Park was being prepared, Jeff Goldblum called the Santa Fe Institute, talked with Doyle Farmer, who was one of the fathers of chaos theory, and he asked him about how does a chaotician behave, you know? And well, if you have seen the movie, no advice was taken, really. Anyway, but the point made by the character, the Ian Malcolm, is good. It's good. As the idea of life finds its way. If you have a living system that can evolve, it can evolve into wherever it's possible for living systems. So how do you manage that? Okay, is it possible to manage that at all? Okay, there's a number of things that people have been thinking about in terms of, let's say, controlling the evolvability of design systems, okay? But all of them at the genetic level, essentially designing circuits that will kill you as soon as some kind of threshold is reached. But of course, again, you have the life finds its way. How do you guarantee that you get into that properly? Well, let me mention some things that kind of support the idea that this is a good time to think about this. On the one hand, over the last just few years, there's been a lot of development in the area of engineering proteins, genetic circuits, etc. There's been success in engineering key molecules like rubisco, which is the most important protein in the biosphere, involving photosynthesis and the efficiency of photosynthesis and carbon sequestration. You have good advances in other engineering of proteins. Of course, efficiency cannot scale up indefinitely. You know, evolution has been very efficient in doing a number of things. You can do a number of things, and even slight changes can help. The phytochrome proteins involved in water transport, etc., have been engineered recently, and it looks like it's not unreasonable to think that we can use that in natural systems. Then there's the other issue that I will address, which is what kind of organism do you actually engineer if you have to. Of course, I'm skipping a little detail of here, which is that this idea goes against any kind of biosafety approach, right? You really want to build things and deliver them in nature, right? It's a different story, right? There's a number of organisms you can use, and as we point out, we don't need actually to intervene necessarily onto ecosystem. We can intervene on the result of human activity as wastelands, for example. And I'll go for that in a second, okay? In the meantime, of course, everything that we can do, and we're trying to build an international consortium to do that, is to actually inspect the problem at different scales, microcosms, macrocosms, mesocosms, etc. And one candidate that we are exploring also, just mention that because I think it's an interesting point, is what is the most important outcome of human activities in terms of massive materials that are being created. Of course, cities and abandoned cities. That's two interesting targets that are online. Well, our idea is the following, and this is kind of a very simple, logical resume of what we have in mind. It's kind of what we call the 4 terraformation motifs. Terraformation meaning terraforming Earth. And what we plan is, the idea is, not engineering organisms only, engineering interactions with the organisms and their hosts in natural systems. Using a number of different mechanisms that we know from the experience that we have, provide a safeguard that is not only genetic, but also ecological. These involve the following. On the one hand, there's a possibility of engineering cooperation, right? Cooperative interactions, as many of you probably know, are very important, very special, and they can be fragile in some conditions, they can be very robust in others, but essentially require a tight connection between 2 partners, right? The idea of engineering symbiosis, okay, it's been around in synthetic biology. One of the first milestones in that was done in Pam Silber's lab at Harvard, where they used these cyanobacteria. They engineered so in such a way that they can invade, for example, zebrafish embryos or mammalian cells. And they found out a very interesting thing, is that to their surprise, I guess, the cyanobacteria were able to actually divide inside the cells and keep going, right, without interfering much anything. Of course, there's no link here between the photosynthetic activity of the bacteria and their hosts, right? But it's an interesting example that many things may be doable, okay? And just in the last 2 years, several groundbreaking work has shown that it actually can be done. It can be done in the most interesting context, which is engineering microbes and plants, something that is already there, right? That we know that nitrogen is fixed in plants by symbiotic bacteria. What it came as a surprise again is that we can actually evolve those symbiotic relationships that by forcing a pair of a host and a microbe to go together, right? And they found out actually that in some associations which involve fungus and algae, cyanobacteria and yeast, but also in actual plants, in crops, you can actually see that the engineered symbiosis goes into a state where the symbiont goes inside the nodules. So it's physically involved inside the nodules, so it's going to be replicated with the plant. So an experiment of cooperation that in nature takes a long time really to develop can actually be made real. Okay? That's a great thing because we could use existing microbes that you have there, that may be just pathogens, engineer them, okay? So they go inside the nodules of the plants that they are in an arid ecosystem. And if you are successful, then we can actually change the system and push the system out from the tipping point. And if we are unsuccessful, what's going to happen is that your engineered microbe is going to go into the wild type, right? You're just going to lose your information, okay? So another possibility, which is one of the ones that we are seriously exploring now, which some of the experts on this area, is actually doing an indirect cooperation, right? What if you engineer a kind of microbe that is capable of generating polymers that go into the soil and that allow more water to be retained, okay? That's something that is going to help the plant, and the plant is going to help, luckily, the microbe, right? So it actually is one thing that is in our agenda as kind of the first thing that we think it's interesting to do. Just to mention that one of the most interesting structures that I wasn't aware a few years ago is concerning arid ecosystems. It's called the soil crust. It's kind of the skin of these arid ecosystems is formed by a very complex ecosystem with cyanobacteria, algae, fungi, mosses. It's really, really interesting. It has a lot of properties that when you are familiar with stem cell technology and regenerative medicine, you find out to your surprise that some of the features that you see there remind you a lot about how tissues are organized. Okay? So maybe engineering approaches can be useful here to do something interesting. Another place where we think that engineering can be really useful involve, for example, sewage. Sewage is not the kind of place where we would like to live, so I usually don't have much concerns about that. So what if we engineer things that go into particular that system. And for that, we have a number of potential scenarios that we could exploit to do several things. An interesting strategy that has been developed in some context, and I think that in a way kind of captures the philosophy here, is this work and die designs. Imagine you want, for example, to fill concrete cracks, okay, which is an important problem. And several people, including a group of students some years ago, proposed engineering schemes where you actually engineer bacteria that can live in these environments, which are very alkaline. And essentially, they could be very happy, create a special polymer using calcium carbonate and other biologically derived molecules. They feel that, and they cannot live well outside that. So essentially, once you are completing your task, you die, right? This was kind of a proof of concept again, but now it seems that big advances are going on in that. And this is, in a way, a basic picture, a bit more detail of our plans. This is, of course, the logic diagrams. We have been moving step by step into constructs, genetic constructs, into developing a new theory. So we need to develop a parallel theory of standard population dynamics. What happens if you put a synthetic organism under these and these conditions, right? And let me just go quickly into a number of issues that I think are interesting to mention. One is, you could say, well, you are proposing a technology that implies that microorganisms, in particular, can be released into nature. But this is actually something that might happen no matter what, because there's a lot of people, and I know some of them, these biohackers that are actually building things at home, right? I know people, I don't know how they get that, but that they have PCR machines at home, and they are playing with that already. So it's very, very important to have a picture of what to expect. What is this going to become in a real ecological context when you deliver that, right? When you just release the organisms. Let me point to something that is important. This has connections with invasion ecology, which is a very active area in ecology. So what happens when an exotic species goes into a new ecosystem? And although we know in many cases that that's a disaster, in most cases we know that it fails. So invaders systematically fail. And there are good reasons to think that engineered microbes are going to fail. There's the need of a new synthesis, as I mentioned at the beginning. So if you want to develop this bioengineering, it means that you have to go from the ecosystem scale where species interact into the ways that particular pairwise interactions take place, into the way what is the target of your engineering acts at the level of the networks, okay? And then at the level of the engineering, at the level of the cloning and everything you have to do. That will require a lot of things to get together, and there's no such a thing as a synthesis yet. There's a good connection with a problem that I think that also illustrates the potential for this research into going to a different direction, which is that, of course, we only have one Earth to experiment, if you want. But we have ecosystems also there, right? Well, not there, inside us, which involve real ecologies, really complex ecologies, dominated by cooperative interactions. As far as we know, so far, the statistical properties of these systems are not very different from the real ecosystems that we have in the rainforest. And as you know also, there's an active work now in biomedical research in terms of intervening the microbiome, which is kind of the interface between potential drugs and our body. And the connections are many. This is a co-evolved system that has been co-evolving with us for a very, very long time, as the biosphere has involved the co-evolution between the climate and living systems. So we expect a lot of things to learn from that, and maybe some of the things that we are going to go to create in our research might have impact in this area. And let me finish just with the last thing, which I think is important. It is true that engineering the biosphere means that you're likely to change it in some ways, right? We don't know to what extent. We don't know if that means that ecosystems that are going to be intervened are going to change, right? But there's the question of what we want. We want to preserve the biosphere as it is. And I just want to make a parenthesis. I'm not saying let's mess with the biosphere and give up biodiversity. It's not like let's go to hot spot of the diversity and mess it up. No, it's not like that. But we have to intervene. And there are two possibilities here, I think. One is not to do it and see what happens, right? And the other thing is intervene and have in mind that ecological systems have a big capacity for reconstructing themselves. To what time scale I'm talking about? Well, not the time scale of 5 years, maybe 50 years, maybe 100 years. But if we are thinking about the next generations, I do think that we have to think in terms of redesign the biosphere, going into different states, but those states will have high diversity, will have the regions we know. And maybe the phrase that captures that, that connects with the beginning, the predictability, is that the future maybe cannot be predicted, okay? But we can invent the futures. Thank you.